So if you're watching this video, I assume you're familiar on some level with the Horn of the Abyss mod for Heroes of Might and Magic 3. If not, then basically it's a very well known, very popular mod for the game that enhances it in numerous ways. It's widely considered to be a kind of vanilla plus mod because the changes it makes are very intuitive, they're very professionally done, and they feel like a natural continuation of the game itself. The main change is the addition of the Cove Town, which is a pretty massive addition. But what I'm going to be focusing on in this video is the new version of the game which has just come out at the start of 2020, which is not a drastic change compared to previous versions, but it will be interesting for those of you who are familiar with the game or the mod already. So the Horn of the Abyss team are currently working on a second new town to add into the mod called the Factory Town, and that wasn't actually completed in time to be released. They do have a kind of tradition of releasing new versions of the mod every new year, but they basically said the Factory wasn't ready. They wanted to make sure they do it to a high standard. So it's possible now that we won't see Factory until next year, which is completely fair enough because they are of course just volunteer modders working in their free time and they just want to make sure they get it done right. However, they have added in a few interesting changes for this new version. The main one is the Wasteland terrain, which you can see me on right here. This will of course be very familiar to anyone who has played Heroes of Might and Magic 2 because it was part of that game, and they have now added it into Heroes 3. This is going to be the native terrain of the Factory Town once they've finished it, but for now they have just added the terrain on its own along with a couple of other changes. So the terrain adds a number of new map objects, and we're just going to quickly go through them just to introduce them and show what they're like. So the first one is the Derrick, and the Derrick is basically completely the same as the Watermill from the Grassland terrain. If you're playing in the first week, it will give you 500 gold, and if you're playing from the second week onwards, anytime you visit it in a new week, it will give you 1000 gold instead, for free. So the next object is the Warlock's Lab, which is a pretty powerful object. Basically what it does is it's like a marketplace on steroids, but only for the 4 precious resources. It enables you to transfer any of these resources into another at a 1-to-1 ratio, so you can, for example, take 4 crystals and convert them into 4 gems, or vice versa, or any other combination you like. So as you can imagine, it's pretty powerful, and presumably on most maps it's likely to be pretty heavily guarded. The next new object is the Trailblazer, which works a little bit like the stables, except instead of improving your movement speed, it will instead lower the movement terrain penalty that you would normally get for travelling over Wasteland, which is going to be pretty helpful if you have any creatures on you which aren't factory creatures. The next object is the Prospector, and the Prospector is basically the equivalent of the Leprechaun from grassy terrain, and unlike the Leprechaun who gives you either 5 gems or 500 gold, this guy will give you either 500 gold or 5 sulfur instead. And the final object is pretty interesting but also potentially extremely powerful, and it's called the Grave. What happens with the Grave is if you land on it, you then have the potential to dig it up in the same fashion that you would dig up the Grail, but instead of digging up the Grail you get a combination of a minor artifact plus anything up to 5000 gold, so potentially actually extremely powerful, but in any case should give map designers a few interesting toys to play with. One thing I should mention about the Grave is it lowers your morale by -3 when you dig it up, so probably best to stick to a secondary hero for that one. Otherwise, the changes made by the Wasteland terrain are purely visual, but I have to give a particular mention to the very cool looking dragon skeleton. Next thing the mod adds is a new creature called the Steel Golem. In terms of stats, it's basically a midway point between the Iron Golem and the Gold Golem. But the real reason they added the Steel Golem is because the Iron Golem was felt to be too slow in the experimental workshop, which led to these ridiculously lengthy fights where people would be going in with harpy hags and potentially just kiting the golems for dozens and dozens of turns, which was not very fun for anyone involved. The Steel Golem is the fastest golem and therefore the hardest golem to cheese. Another major change is the addition of the interference skill. So if you played the previous version of Horn of the Abyss, you may know that they changed the resistance skill to make it less RNG-based, so that instead of giving spells a chance to fail, it would instead reduce the opponent's spell power. And that was probably one of the more controversial changes added by the mod, because people felt it was a bit too much of an overhaul and didn't really fit the theme of continuity that the mod otherwise stuck to pretty well. So the solution was to change the resistance skill back to the way it used to work, and instead introduce the interference skill, which basically does what their version of the resistance skill used to do instead. And to complement that, they've added in 3 new artifacts: the Charm of Eclipse, the Plate of Dying Light, and the Seal of Sunset, which on standard maps are basically a replacement for the previous resistance artifacts, all of which are still available on the map editor, along with the resistance skill, but both those artifacts and the resistance skill are now designed to not appear in standard games. Which also means that the resistance specialist Thorgrim is no longer going to appear in standard games, and has been replaced by a new ranger called Giselle, who is the interference specialist, and basically does the same thing that Thorgrim used to do in the previous version of the mod. Lastly, they've tried to rebalance the secondary skills somewhat. For example, they reduced the logistics skill from 30% improved movement range to only 20%, which I think is also a means of nerfing the logistics specialists, who are widely considered to be up there with the best heroes in the game. And I think it's also an attempt to make the logistics skill a little bit less essential, because previously it's been pretty much a no-brainer to take it anytime it's offered. Now at least it's a little bit less powerful. They've also nerfed the intelligence skill to be a 50% boost to your spell points instead of a 100% boost. Personally, I'm not sure how I feel about that one, just because I never felt that intelligence was an overpowered skill, but there should still be cases where you would take it, so they haven't completely killed it. They've also enhanced the mysticism skill to give you up to 15 spell points per turn instead of the previous 4, which in my opinion is more than enough to make it worth considering in some cases. Whereas previously it's been considered borderline useless, it is actually potentially pretty good now. For example, 15 spell points is almost enough to cast Chain Lightning, and being able to cast Chain Lightning one more time per day is potentially very powerful. Lastly, they've doubled the effect of the estate skill, so that it now grants up to an extra 1000 gold per turn instead of the previous 500. That's probably the one I'm most unsure about, just because the estate skill was already a bit of a no-brainer on scouting heroes, and now it has the potential to be a little bit of a game changer. For example, Horn of the Abyss introduces a new hero called Lena, and Lena's specialty is to give you 350 gold per day, in addition to having basic estates. So if you happen to find Lena in your tavern, she will now give you 600 gold off the bat per day, going up to potentially 1350 per day if you level up her estate skill. So I think that's potentially a little bit too powerful, but I'm sure they will nerf it if people really don't like it. And that's pretty much it for the major changes added by the new version, but they have hinted at a couple of other things. For example, there's this kind of serpent creature, and they've also hinted at another creature, and there is speculation that that's going to be the level 7 creature of the factory town. A member of the HotA team has also hinted that there will be an armadillo creature coming. It's thought that this might be the level 3 creature of the factory town. Unfortunately, all we have to go off is a 240p YouTube video, which is also in Russian. But it is a member of the HotA team, so I'm pretty sure it's legit. Finally, they've added 2 new maps to the game. One is called the Great Wasteland, and the other is called Gold Rush. Presumably those are there to show off a few of the new features they've added in the new version. I am planning to do a playthrough of the Great Wasteland in the near future, so do check the link in the description if you'd like to check that out. If it's not out yet, then do consider subscribing, and that way you can catch it once I've uploaded it. Otherwise, thanks for watching guys, I'll see you next time.